New York was wrapped in silver rain that night. From the penthouse ballroom of the Waldorf Hotel, the city looked like a field of trembling stars blurred behind the glass. Inside, the gala glittered with too much laughter and too little warmth. Champagne flutes chimed, perfume hung heavy, and every conversation felt rehearsed. Beneath the chandelier, Adrian Holt stood alone. His tuxedo perfectly fitted his smile, politely absent. People whispered his name with equal parts awe and pity. Holt Financial's billionaire founder, the man who built an empire before 30, and then stopped living when his fiancée died. 3 years had passed since the accident, yet his expression still looked like someone who'd never come home. Across the room, Evelyn Carter balanced a silver tray of champagne. She was 28, working the event as a temp to cover her mother's care bills. Her shoes pinched, her hair was pinned too tight, but her eyes were alert, quietly watching the crowd, as if memorizing a world she didn't belong to. She'd always been like that, an observer in a room full of performers. At one table, a group of guests laughed too loudly, their words slicing through the music. "You're telling me you've never been in love, not once." The question was directed at her. Evelyn froze caught in their spotlight. She tried to smile. "I suppose not. Some people are better at it than others. Or maybe no one's ever tried hard enough." A man sneered, earning a ripple of laughter. Her throat tightened, heat rising behind her eyes, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her blush. Then from somewhere behind her, a man's voice cut through the noise, low, steady, disarmingly calm. "Can you pretend to be my girlfriend for a day?" The room seemed to tilt. Conversations stilled. Even the string quartet faltered for a heartbeat. Evelyn turned confused and saw him. Adrian Holt, the billionaire who'd never smiled, was standing a few feet away, his gaze fixed on her with unnerving gentleness. He wasn't smirking or performing. He looked serious, almost vulnerable, as if he needed the question more than she needed an answer. Around them, the crowd watched with hungry fascination. Evelyn blinked. "I'm sorry what he set down his untouched champagne flute. You heard me." His tone was soft, but something in it commanded the entire ballroom to quiet. "Can you pretend to be my girlfriend for a day?" She stared at him, tray trembling in her hands. Was this a joke? The billionaire asking the waitress for a favor no one would believe. 100 thoughts flashed through her mind. Every headline she'd ever read about him. Every rumor whispered in tabloids about grief and solitude. But when she looked closer, she saw it. The same hollow ache she felt in herself. Loneliness recognized loneliness. Why, she asked finally, her voice barely above the whisper of the rain outside. Adrian's eyes didn't flinch. "Because I think we both need to remind people we're still human." Someone near the bar gasped. Cameras clicked. The orchestra, uncertain, began to play again, a slow waltz that filled the silence. Evelyn wanted to laugh, to step back, to disappear. But something about the way he said it, without arrogance, without demand, made her pulse slow instead of race. It was as if, for a brief, impossible second, the world had shrunk to two people who'd been invisible too long. A spotlight of stillness in a room built on noise. She managed to speak. "You don't even know me. Maybe that's the point." The words landed softly, almost kind. He offered his hand palm open, waiting. It wasn't an order. It was an invitation. The tray between them felt heavier with every second. Around them, eyes burned with gossip phones angled for proof. Evelyn could almost hear her mother's voice in her head. "Don't get involved with people like that." But then again, People like that never looked at her the way he did now, like she wasn't just part of the background. Her fingers twitched. Against all logic, she set the tray down. Her hand slid into his. Warm, steady, real. A small gasp rippled through the onlookers. Adrian inclined his head slightly as though sealing an unspoken pact. Good, he said under his breath. Now smile, they're watching. She tried awkward at first, then real when she saw how absurdly calm he looked amid the chaos. Flashbulbs popped, reporters whispered. The lonely billionaire and the waitress who'd never been in love captured mid-smile. Evelyn could feel the absurdity of it all, pressing on her chest, but also something else, an inexplicable calm, as if she'd just stepped off a ledge and found herself floating instead of falling. "You're insane," she murmured. Adrian's mouth curved the faintest ghost of a smile. "Maybe, but tonight, that's our story." The orchestra swelled rain, slid down the glass, like tears no one wanted to acknowledge. Beneath the golden chandelier, two strangers stood together, their reflections crossing in the marble floor. For the first time in years, someone looked at Adrian Holt and didn't see a ghost. For the first time in her life, Evelyn Carter felt seen. Outside, the city lights flickered through the storm, and the moment hung suspended, fragile, cinematic. The instant before everything changed. Morning light crawled through the blinds of a cramped Brooklyn apartment, landing across a stack of unpaid bills and a withered houseplant that refused to die. Evelyn Carter sat at the kitchen table, her coffee long gone cold. The city was already awake, sirens and traffic rumbling below, but she felt detached, suspended between disbelief and laughter. She had spent the night replaying that surreal moment, the billionaire's hand reaching for hers, the room's stunned silence, the cameras flashing. She had walked out of the gala before anyone could ask her name. Now the story was everywhere. Her phone buzzed nonstop with headlines she didn't dare open. She turned the volume up on the radio just to drown it out, but then she heard his name. Adrian Holt makes unexpected appearance at last night's charity gala, the host said. The reclusive billionaire stunned attendees when he was seen holding hands with an unidentified woman. Evelyn groaned and shut the radio off. In the next room, her mother called softly, "Evie, is that you?" She forced a smile and went in. Her mother, Margaret, sat by the window of her small assisted living room, knitting with trembling hands. The oxygen machine hummed beside her. Evelyn brushed her shoulder gently. "Morning, Mom. You look tired," Margaret said, eyes warm but sharp. "Work late, something like that." She poured water into the flower vase on the table. 3 daisies from the cafe's leftovers. "Still keeping those alive," her mother teased. "They're fighters," Evelyn said. "Like you." Her mother smiled, but Evelyn noticed how thin her wrists had become. That was why she worked 2 jobs and still barely slept. There wasn't room in her life for fairy tales or billionaires who asked for pretend love. Yet when she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the stillness in his eyes that mirrored her own. Across state lines in the quiet hills of Vermont, Adrian Holt woke to silence. His estate stretched over the lake like glass, the kind of place people dreamed of, but he rarely noticed anymore. He stood at the balcony, coffee steaming in the cold air, watching fog rise from the water. The newspapers lay unread on the table beside him. His assistant Clara knocked softly. "You made the front page again." "Of course I did." His voice was dry, detached. She hesitated. "You looked different last night." "Different how alive," she said, simply then, left him to his solitude. Adrian let the word linger in the air like something fragile. Alive. The truth was he hadn't felt that way in years. Not since the accident. Not since the woman he was supposed to marry died on a rain-slick road while he was behind the wheel. The guilt had been a constant echo, louder than any applause, quieter than any prayer. He had built empires, donated millions, attended galas where people whispered condolences like compliments, and then a woman he'd never met had looked at him without pity. The waitress with defiance in her eyes, Evelyn. The name tasted unfamiliar yet grounding. For a brief moment, holding her hand had silenced the noise inside his head. Maybe that was why he couldn't stop thinking about her. That afternoon at Maple Street Book and Cafe, the air smelled of coffee and rain-damp pages. Evelyn wiped down tables, pretending not to notice that everyone had their phones out. A coworker whispered, "Evie, tell me that's not you on Twitter." She glanced at the screen, her picture beside Adrian Holt, and her stomach dropped. "It's edited," she lied, even as she knew it wasn't. A few customers looked up, whispering. She hid in the back, pressing her palms to her face. She couldn't afford this kind of attention. Not with her mother's condition, not with rent overdue. Then her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Evelyn Carter. The voice was smooth, unmistakable. Adrian Holt. Her grip tightened on the phone. "How did you get my number?" "I have resources," he said. "I also owe you an explanation." "An explanation for what the circus you started. For the truth," he said. "Meet me tomorrow, 2 p.m. Cafe is fine." "Why would I do that?" Because he paused. "You looked at me like I was human. I'd like to return the favor." She didn't answer. He didn't push. The line clicked dead. She stared at the screen, heart thudding. Maybe he wanted to apologize, maybe to control the narrative. Either way, she knew she'd go. She always went where questions refused to leave her alone. That night, Adrian sat in his study, surrounded by oil paintings, unfinished portraits of a woman beside a lake. Her face blurred colors, muted. His therapist had once told him grief was just love with nowhere to go. Maybe that was why he painted, to give his love a place to hide. He picked up a brush but couldn't bring himself to move it. Instead, he replayed the sound of her voice over the phone, the mix of caution and courage. He found himself smiling. Barely. The next day, sunlight slanted through the cafe's windows, painting warm stripes across the wooden floor. Evelyn arranged flowers on the counter, trying to focus. When the bell above the door chimed, every nerve in her body recognized him before her eyes did. Adrian stood there dressed simply in a gray coat, his presence turning heads. Conversations hushed. He approached the counter slowly, as if entering someone else's world. "You came," she said quietly. "You called." He nodded once. "May I sit? You're already making people stare," she muttered, but gestured to a corner table. He followed. When they sat, he looked around the tiny cafe, the cluttered shelves, the small chalkboard that read, "Love grows here." "It suits you," he said. "What does this place? It feels honest." She folded her arms. "You're here to apologize, I assume?" "Partly. Also to make a proposal." She blinked. "A proposal?" He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I need someone to stand beside me tomorrow at a press conference. The board insists I show stability. If I show up alone, they'll bury my foundation project. But if I appear with someone genuine, someone who looks like she doesn't care who I am, it changes everything." She laughed softly, incredulous. "So you want me to pretend again, just for one day?" His tone was even, but his eyes betrayed fatigue. There's nothing romantic in it. It's business or survival. You have $1 billion and still need survival tactics. Money doesn't fix reputation, he said quietly, or loneliness. The honesty in his voice disarmed her. She studied him, searching for arrogance, but found none. Just exhaustion and a strange sincerity. You could hire anyone, she said. Exactly. That's why it has to be you. The cafe's hum returned as if the universe exhaled. Evelyn glanced at the flowers by the window, sunlight refracting through the glass. Maybe it was madness, maybe curiosity, but something inside her whispered yes, long before her lips did. Later, when she closed the cafe, she saw his text appear on her phone. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Don't dress up. Just be yourself. She smiled in spite of herself. The evening light reflected on the screen, golden and fleeting, like a promise neither of them fully understood yet. The next afternoon, the rain had cleared, and New York looked polished again, as if the city itself had been preparing for their meeting. Evelyn stood outside the cafe, adjusting the strap of her canvas bag, wondering for the 100th time if she was making a mistake. She had promised herself she would not get drawn into anyone's world but her own. And yet, here she was, waiting for a billionaire. A black car pulled up at exactly 2. Adrian stepped out wearing a charcoal coat and that same unreadable calm that had startled her at the gala. He opened the back door. Evelyn. She hesitated. This is ridiculous. Probably, he agreed. But I'd rather face the world with someone real beside me than another PR illusion. She sighed and got in. The leather smelled expensive, but faintly of paint thinner, which somehow fit him perfectly. As the car merged into traffic, she watched the skyline slide by. Tell me what exactly I've agreed to, she said. A press conference, he replied. We're announcing a community initiative. My board believes the public only listens if they see a softer version of me. You'll play that part. Your soft version, my human version. His lips twitched slightly. There will be questions about us. Just smile and say, we met through mutual friends. That's a terrible lie. The best kind, he said, glancing at her. Simple. She looked out the window at the endless gray of the Hudson River. You could have asked an actress. I did once. It ended with an NDA and a lawsuit. Good to know, she muttered. And how do I fit in this circus? You don't act, he said. You just exist. That's why it works. There was a silence then, heavy but not awkward. She studied his reflection in the glass. Beneath the perfect exterior, she sensed something quietly breaking. When they arrived at the venue, reporters already lined the marble steps. Cameras turned as soon as the doors opened. Adrian offered his arm. Ready for what? Public execution. Something like that? She looped her hand through his and forced a smile. The flashbulbs were blinding. Mr. Holt, is she your girlfriend? Someone shouted. Adrian answered without hesitation. Yes. The word landed like thunder. Evelyn blinked, but kept walking. Side, he guided her toward the stage where a banner read Holt Foundation, Building Futures Together. As speeches began, she realized the conference was about scholarships for underprivileged students. He spoke with precision and control, never looking at notes, voice measured, but resonant. When the moderator asked about the woman beside him, Adrian looked at her briefly before facing the crowd. Evelyn reminds me that compassion is the only investment that never fails. The room murmured approval. She stared at him stunned. He had just made her sound like a principal, not a person. Yet somehow it didn't feel patronizing. It felt protective. Afterward, journalists swarmed. How long have you two been dating? 3 months, Evelyn said, Before she could stop herself, Adrian arched an eyebrow. 3 months, he repeated softly. Sounded believable, she whispered back. He hid a smile. For an hour they answered questions and shook hands. She noticed how carefully he listened to everyone, how he never looked bored despite the monotony. Maybe he was better at pretending than he admitted. When they finally escaped to the car, she exhaled. That was insane. It went well, he said. You were perfect. Perfectly terrified. He looked amused. That's what made you believable. She rolled her eyes. You could try gratitude. Thank you, he said quietly, and there was something genuine in it that silenced her retort. The city sped past again, sunlight bouncing off windows, like flashes of memory. So what now, she asked. Now, he said, I'll probably survive another day in the boardroom thanks to you. And what do I get, dinner? Is that a demand or an apology? A choice, he said. She hesitated, but curiosity won. Fine. Dinner. They stopped at a small restaurant in Soho, the kind of place that smelled of basil and brick oven smoke. The hostess stared when she recognized Adrian Holt, but said nothing. They took a booth in the corner. For a while they talked about everything except money and reputation. She told him about the cafe, about her mother's garden before she got sick. He told her about Vermont winters and the silence that could swallow sound. When dessert came, he asked, Do you regret it? The press conference, the moment at the gala. She thought about the champagne light, the stillness when he spoke. No, she said. It was insane, but also honest. Honest. You looked like someone who hadn't spoken to another real person in years. He laughed under his breath. That's probably accurate. And you, she asked, why did you choose me? He met her gaze expression, softening. Because you looked at me like I was human. She stared down at her glass. You keep saying that, because it keeps surprising me. They left just as dusk fell. On the sidewalk, a gust of cold air swept through the street. She hugged her coat tighter. He offered his scarf, and she shook her head. You really don't have to play the gentleman. Maybe I'm not playing. His voice was low, the kind that brushed against something unguarded inside her. She didn't answer. The car ride back was quiet. At her building, he said, Thank you again. She opened the door. You know you're not as cold as people think. Careful, he said, you'll ruin my reputation. She smiled faintly. Good night, Adrian. Good night, Evelyn. Upstairs, she leaned against her door, heart pounding in a way that felt inconvenient and alive. She told herself it was just adrenaline, just curiosity. Yet she found herself looking at her phone, expecting a message. It arrived 2 hours later. Thank you for today. You made them believe. She typed back before overthinking. Maybe next time I'll believe it too. In Vermont, Adrian stared at the text glowing in the dark. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar tug at his chest. Hope. The invitation came 3 days later, folded neatly in an envelope that smelled faintly of cedar and rain. Evelyn found it taped to the cafe door when she arrived for her morning shift. No signature, just a short note written in calm, precise handwriting. You did well. Let's make it convincing. Vermont, this weekend. Beneath the words was a small card with an address. She turned it over twice, unsure if she wanted to laugh or scream. She knew what it meant. Another performance, another pretend weekend. But a voice inside her whispered that it might also mean closure, or at least understanding. She told her manager she needed 2 days off and packed a small suitcase that night. One dress, a sweater, her mother's favorite book of poems. No expectations. When the car arrived Saturday morning, the driver greeted her with quiet formality. The ride was long and smooth, the landscape shifting from city chaos to rolling green hills wrapped in autumn mist. By the time they reached Vermont, the sun was sinking behind a canopy of gold leaves. The house appeared suddenly beyond a curve in the road, a glass and timber structure perched above a still lake that mirrored the sky. It looked like something out of a magazine and yet strangely lonely, as if built for silence. Adrian stood on the porch sleeves, rolled to his elbows, hair mussed by the wind. He wasn't in a suit this time, just a gray sweater and jeans. He looked human. "You came," he said. "Curiosity kills faster than fear," she replied, trying to sound braver than she felt. His smile was brief but real. "Come in." Inside the house smelled of wood smoke and turpentine. Canvases lined the walls, some half-finished, some just ghosts of color. "You paint," she said, touching one gently. "When I can't sleep," he answered. "Which is most nights. They're beautiful. They're attempts," he said simply. Dinner was quiet, but not uncomfortable. He cooked pasta himself, pouring her wine without asking. Moving through the kitchen with practiced precision, outside the lake shimmered with the last light of day. She noticed how he looked out the window, often as if expecting someone to return from the water. Later, while exploring, she found the room he never mentioned. A studio. Dozens of portraits filled the space. Same woman, different seasons. Always near the lake. She was beautiful, Evelyn said softly when he appeared behind her. "She was," he said. "You loved her." "I killed her," he whispered. She turned sharply, but he wasn't crying. His face was calm, too calm. "The night of the accident. I was driving. I thought I could control the rain. I couldn't." She didn't know what to say, so she didn't. Silence was the only kindness big enough to hold that kind of grief. After a while he murmured, "People call me cold. But cold is just what's left when guilt stops burning." She reached out, hesitated, then touched his arm. "You're not the only one who stopped living," she said. He looked at her, searching for the meaning behind her words. "What do you mean? I've never said I love you to anyone," she confessed. "Not because I don't want to, but because I don't trust what love turns people into." He nodded slowly, as if he understood more than she meant to share. That evening they sat by the fireplace. The only light came from the flames and the reflection of the lake outside. For a long time they said nothing. The air was thick with things neither dared to name. Then she spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we're both just waiting for someone brave enough to stay." He looked at her for a long moment, the fire painting his face in gold and shadow. "Maybe," he said finally, "we just stopped believing anyone would." Hours passed. The wind rattled the windows softly. Evelyn drifted toward sleep, lulled by the crackle of fire and the soft rhythm of his breathing nearby. At some point she realized he had covered her with a blanket. When she woke near dawn, the fire was low, and Adrian was outside, standing by the lake in the mist barefoot, staring at the water like it held a secret. She stepped out quietly. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Didn't try?" "Still trying to control the rain." He smiled faintly. "Still trying to forgive myself." She followed his gaze to the horizon where the sky was breaking into pale blue. "You know," she said, "forgiveness doesn't come when we earn it. It comes when someone decides we've suffered enough." He turned to her, eyes shadowed but soft. "And who decides that? Maybe someone who knows what it feels like." They went back inside and made breakfast together. Simple things: toast, eggs, coffee. At one point their hands brushed, reaching for the same cup. and neither pulled away immediately. He studied her face, as if trying to memorize it. She felt the air shift heavy and electric, but neither spoke. Later, he suggested they take the canoe out on the lake. She laughed, but he was serious. The water was smooth as glass, reflecting the pale autumn sky. They paddled in silence until the middle where he stopped. This was her favorite place, he said. She used to say the lake forgave everything. Does it? Not yet, he said quietly. When they returned to shore, clouds had gathered. Inside, the light turned amber and soft. He built another fire, and she wandered through the house again. Drawn to one particular painting by the window, unfinished blank, except for a faint outline. That one's new, she said. I started it the day after the gala, he admitted. Couldn't finish it. Why not? Because I didn't know what her eyes looked like yet. She felt her pulse catch. And now he met her gaze. Now I do. For the first time since she'd arrived, she couldn't tell what was real and what was pretend. Maybe the line had already blurred beyond repair. She turned away, heart-pounding, pretending to study another canvas. Behind her he spoke softly, almost to himself. If you're going to run, do it now. Why? Because I'm starting to forget this is just an arrangement. Her breath caught, but before she could answer, thunder rumbled outside, distant but heavy. Rain began to fall again, soft against the glass. He looked at her, and the air between them felt like something alive. Neither moved closer. They didn't need to. The silence said everything. Two people suspended between guilt and hope, learning to breathe in the same rhythm. For the first time in years, the house felt less like a monument to sorrow and more like the beginning of something uncertain but real. The next morning arrived soft and silver, the lake outside Adrian's house, perfectly still, like it was holding its breath. Evelyn woke to the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The quiet was different here, not the city's heavy kind that pressed against your ears, but the kind that wrapped around you like a blanket. When she stepped into the kitchen, Adrian was already there. Barefoot shirt sleeves rolled sunlight, hitting the dark strands of his hair. He glanced up and smiled slightly. Morning, I didn't know how you take your coffee. Black, she said. You same, simpler that way. She sat across from him, feeling that strange calm again. The one that made her forget this was supposed to be pretend. After breakfast, he asked if she wanted to see the rest of the property. She followed him outside, their shoes crunching on the gravel path. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. He showed her the old boathouse, the greenhouse his mother had built decades ago, and the wooden dock that stretched like a finger into the lake. It was peaceful too, peaceful for someone who had spent years surrounded by noise. She realized he wasn't showing off. He was sharing something private, almost sacred. You come here often, she asked. Only when I want to remember her, he said. Or forget myself. They spent the afternoon in quiet rhythm. She arranged flowers she'd brought from the cafe, wild daisies and lilies from the edge of the road, placing them in an old vase near the fireplace. He painted at his easel, brushstrokes slow, thoughtful. The only sounds were the gentle sweep of bristles and the occasional crackle of wood. Evelyn watched him from the sofa, her fingers curled around a cup of tea. His concentration fascinated her. He seemed most alive when he was creating, lost in color and silence. You're staring, he said, without looking up. You're used to being stared at, she replied. Not like that, like what he finally looked up. Like you're trying to see what's left of me. She didn't look away. Maybe I am. His gaze lingered the air between them, tightening. Then he smiled faintly, breaking the moment. You're impossible, so I've been told. As the day slipped toward evening, rain began to fall again, soft and patient. They moved to the living room where the glow of the fire painted everything gold. Evelyn sat on the rug, arranging a small bouquet, while Adrian tuned an old record player. The crackle of vinyl filled the air, and an old jazz melody began to play smooth and melancholy. I didn't take you for the dancing type, she said. Neither did I, he answered, extending his hand. But maybe we should start pretending properly. She hesitated, then took his hand. He pulled her gently to her feet. The music was slow, and at first they moved awkwardly, both aware of the space between them. But as the rhythm settled, something loosened. Her hand fit against his chest, steady over his heartbeat. His palm rested lightly against her back, guiding but never claiming. The firelight flickered over their faces, warm against the cool rhythm of rain outside. Neither spoke. Every turn, every breath felt like a conversation without words. When the song ended, they didn't let go right away. Their eyes met his, searching hers, uncertain but soft. The silence felt full, not empty. For a second, he looked as if he might say something, but instead he stepped back and whispered, "Thank you." She smiled faintly. For what? For reminding me what it feels like to be in a room that isn't empty. Later, they ate dinner in comfortable quiet. Evelyn laughed at something small, a candle flickering out mid-bite, and Adrian found himself laughing too, really laughing, the sound startling him. She caught the surprise on his face. What? Nothing, he said, still smiling. Just, I'd forgotten what that sounded like. You should do it more often, she said softly. When they cleaned up, she found a half-finished sketch on the counter, her face drawn in swift, delicate lines. You drew me. I was practicing, he said, voice casual, but eyes careful. Does your practice usually involve strangers? Only the ones who don't feel like strangers. She folded the paper gently, unsure what to say. The truth was, she didn't feel like one either. That night she couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but her thoughts hadn't. She stepped out onto the porch barefoot, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. The air was cold, the lake glimmering faintly under the moon. She heard footsteps behind her. Can't sleep either, he asked. Too quiet? He joined her at the railing, hands in his pockets. For a moment they just stood there listening to the night. When I first came here after the accident, he said I thought silence would save me. But sometimes it's just another way to hide. She nodded. I know that kind of silence. He glanced at her. You hide too, maybe. Behind busyness, behind taking care of everyone else. And who takes care of you? She let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. No one's ever asked that before. The words hung there, fragile and dangerous. He turned toward her, then close enough that she could see the faint stubble on his jaw. The sadness still anchored behind his eyes. He didn't reach for her, didn't cross the space. But she felt it anyway, the pull of something real. Something neither of them planned. Then he stepped back, retreating to the safety of distance. Good night, Evelyn. Good night, Adrian. She watched him disappear inside her heart, aching with something she didn't have a name for. In the morning he was distant again. The shift was subtle but sharp, like a door quietly closing. Over breakfast he spoke about meetings, investors, logistics, anything but feelings. She matched his tone, pretending it didn't sting. Maybe this was how pretending always ended, with reality creeping back in cold and quiet. When she packed to leave, he walked her to the car but didn't touch her. "Thank you for coming," he said. "For what it's worth, you made the weekend bearable." "Bearable," she repeated with a small, sad smile. "That's one way to describe it. I didn't mean, I know," she said, cutting him off gently. "It was never meant to feel real." The driver started the engine. She got in, and he stepped back. As the car pulled away, she looked out the window and saw him standing by the lake, motionless, the reflection of the water trembling around his shadow. He looked smaller, somehow less untouchable. She turned away before she could change her mind. But as the miles stretched between them, she realized pretending had already stopped being pretend the moment she'd said yes to Vermont. She didn't know what to call what they'd shared, only that something in her had shifted. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of the ache. It meant she was alive. Monday morning arrived like a cruel trick. Evelyn had barely settled back into her life in Brooklyn when her phone began buzzing nonstop. At first, she ignored it, thinking it was another automated call. But then her coworker ran into the cafe holding her tablet. "Evie, oh my God, have you seen this?" Evelyn's stomach dropped before she even looked. On the screen was a headline, splashed across every gossip site: "Billionaire Adrian Holt's secret weekend with mystery woman at his lake house." Below it were photos her stepping out of his car, laughing at dinner, standing barefoot on the porch wrapped in a blanket. The caption read, "The waitress who stole the billionaire's heart." Her throat went dry. "They followed us," she whispered. "Someone must have." But her words dissolved under the sharp buzz of incoming notifications. Everyone wanted to know who she was. The cafe door chimed, and for the first time, she felt eyes on her not as a person, but as a headline. Across the city, Adrian stood in his office jaw, tight, the same images glowing from a dozen screens. Clara, his assistant, paced nearby. "It's everywhere," she said. "The board's in a panic. They're worried about the investors." "Of course they are," he muttered. "They don't care about truth, only optics." "Adrian, you have to address it. They're calling it an affair. Some outlets think she's your new PR stunt." He turned sharply, anger flashing for the first time in months. "She's not a stunt." Clara hesitated. "Then what is she?" His silence answered everything. Before he could respond, his phone rang. The chairman of the board. He didn't want to answer, but he knew he had to. "Holt," he said. The voice on the other end was clipped all business. "You've made a mess. End it publicly or step down. We can't afford another scandal, not after the foundation leak last quarter." Adrian's grip tightened around the phone. "I'll handle it. Make sure you do. The press conference is at 5. When he hung up, Clara watched him carefully. "What are you going to do?" "What they expect," he said quietly. "Protect what's left of the company, even if it means hurting her." His jaw clenched, especially if it keeps her safe. That afternoon, Evelyn's manager called her into the back office. "Evie, this is chaos. We've had reporters outside since morning. Customers are filming you. I have to let you go until this blows over. Please, I didn't ask for this. I know. But it's bad for business." The words felt like a door slamming inside her chest. She walked out into the drizzle, the city sounds muffled by her pulse. She didn't hear from Adrian all day. When she got home, her mother was watching the news. His face filled the screen, standing at a podium with the Holt Foundation logo behind him. He looked perfectly composed, the man the world expected to see. The reporter asked Mr. Holt, "Are the rumors true? Are you in a relationship with Miss Carter?" He hesitated for half a breath, just long enough for anyone who knew him to see the crack, then said, "No, it was never real. We met through charity work. Any suggestion otherwise is a misunderstanding." Evelyn felt the words hit like a physical blow. It was never real. The same phrase he'd used when she first agreed to help him. Only this time it wasn't a joke. Her mother looked at her confused. Evie was that. But Evelyn couldn't answer. She turned off the TV and stood in the quiet until her reflection in the dark screen blurred. At the same moment, in the back of the press room, Clara watched Adrian step down from the stage, his expression carved in stone. She waited until the cameras stopped flashing before following him into the corridor. "You think that fixed it?" she demanded. "You think lying will keep her safe?" "It will keep them from destroying her," he said, voice low. "They'd dig into her past her mother's medical records, her debts. I've seen what they do, and what about you? I can take it." "No," Clara said. "You can't, not again." But he was already walking away. 2 days later, Evelyn got an envelope in the mail. Inside was a check enough money to cover her mother's care for a year and a note, "I'm sorry." She ripped it in half. That night she sent him a single message. "You can't buy your apology." He didn't reply. Rain returned, cold and endless. Weeks passed. The headlines faded, replaced by fresher scandals, newer distractions, but the quiet left behind was heavier than before. Evelyn went back to visiting her mother daily, sitting by the window pretending to read. "You're quiet," her mother said one afternoon. "You used to hum when you arranged flowers." "I forgot the tune," Evelyn murmured. Her mother took her hand gently. "Then find someone who will remind you." In Vermont, Adrian stopped painting. The easel sat untouched, the brushes stiff with dried color. Every night he stood by the lake, waiting for forgiveness that never came. Clara visited once, found him drinking coffee, gone cold, staring at a blank canvas. "You could fix this," she said softly. "Go to her. She deserves peace, not another headline." "She deserves truth," Clara said, and left him to his ghosts. Then came the twist no one saw coming. A journalist leaked the internal memo showing that Clara, not Evelyn, had been the source of the first leak about the Vermont trip. Her motive was envy and fear. She believed Evelyn would ruin the company's image. When the news broke, Clara resigned quietly, but the damage had already been done. Adrian realized the betrayal had not been Evelyn's or the world's, it had been his own fear. He had let other people decide what she could handle, what she was worth. That night, for the first time since the accident, he cried. Not out of guilt, but because he finally saw the pattern. He had destroyed every good thing that came near him by trying to protect it. In Brooklyn, Evelyn sat by her window, looking out at the streetlight, flickering through the rain. Her phone buzzed again, another unknown number. She didn't answer. Some wounds needed silence before closure. Still, when she closed her eyes, she could see the lake, the firelight, his hand trembling slightly when he said, "Maybe we're both just waiting for someone brave enough to stay." She whispered to the empty room I stayed. The letter came on a Thursday. No return address, no fancy stationery, just a plain white envelope tucked under the cafe door when Evelyn arrived to open. The handwriting was familiar, careful, deliberate, the kind of script that belonged to someone who spent too long choosing every word. She stood there for a long moment, staring at it as if opening it might make everything real again. When she finally tore it open, a single page slipped out slightly creased, faintly smelling of oil paint. "Evelyn," it began. You once told me flowers don't pretend to be perfect. They bloom anyway. I wish I had learned that sooner. I told the world we were never real because I was afraid of what it would cost you, and because I was still hiding behind guilt I called duty. The truth is, you were the first thing that ever felt real after years of pretending. I can't ask for forgiveness, but I can thank you for reminding me what it means to live. I'm leaving the company. Maybe this is the only way to start again. I hope you keep blooming, even if I'm not there to see it. Her hands shook as she read it, and before she knew it, a tear had dropped onto the page, smudging the ink where his name had been. She pressed her lips together, folded the letter carefully, and set it beside the vase of wildflowers on the counter. For the rest of the day, she moved through her shifts as if underwater. Every customer's voice blurred, every movement felt distant. When she finally returned home that night, she sat by the window with the letter open in her lap. She didn't know if it was closure or a confession, only that it hurt in the quietest way possible. In Vermont, Adrian was painting again. The lake outside his window was frozen at the edges, thin layers of ice, forming delicate patterns like veins under glass. His studio smelled of turpentine and pine. Canvases surrounded him, unfinished, relentless. But one stood apart, the one he couldn't finish before. The one with her outline waiting. He had sketched her 100 times from memory. Her hair loose in the morning light, the way she laughed with her eyes before her mouth caught up the way. She looked at him that night, by the fire, when neither of them had the courage to move closer. But this time he didn't need memory. He had the letter she'd left behind. It wasn't long, only a few sentences written in uneven handwriting, but every word felt carved into his chest. You asked me to pretend. I tried, but the love became real before I could stop it. Please don't come after me. Some of us need to be found by peace, not people. He'd found it weeks after she'd left, slipped into the sketchbook she'd once thumbed through. He had read it until the edges wore thin. He wanted to hate himself for what he'd done to her, but hate felt too small. So he painted. He painted until his hands blistered, until dawn bled through the windows. He painted not to forget, but to remember, honestly this time, without excuses, without pretense. When the portrait was done, he didn't frame it. He left it leaning against the wall, facing the lake, like it belonged to something larger than him. The woman in the painting wasn't smiling. She wasn't sad either. She was looking out toward the horizon, her expression calm, alive, unafraid. He called it Morning After the Rain. In the weeks that followed, he disappeared from the public eye. Holt Financial released a statement confirming his resignation and his donation of half his assets to establish the Haven Trust, a foundation supporting women who'd lost their jobs due to media exposure and scandal. He refused interviews, ignored headlines, and spent his days splitting his time between painting and rebuilding an old barn on the edge of his property. The locals called him the recluse with the artist's hands. He didn't mind. The world had finally gone quiet enough for him to hear his own thoughts. Meanwhile, Evelyn's life slowly pieced itself back together. She found a new cafe job in a quieter part of Brooklyn, one where no one recognized her face from old gossip columns. Her mother's health improved little by little. They spent afternoons by the window, drinking tea, reading poetry, and sometimes not talking at all. But the ache lingered, the kind that came not from absence, but from knowing what could have been. Some nights she'd dream of rain and the sound of a paintbrush gliding over canvas. One evening a man came into the cafe, a stranger in a wool coat, carrying a small wrapped package. "Miss Carter?" he asked. She nodded, wary. "This is for you," he said, handing her the parcel. "From a Mr. Holt." Her breath caught. He sent you." "No," the man said. "He didn't send me. He asked me to deliver it if he ever stopped coming into town. He passed this along months ago." Her fingers trembled as she unwrapped the brown paper. Inside was a small painting, her face turned toward the light of a dawn sky. Brushstrokes soft but vivid. Tucked behind the frame was a note written in the same careful script. "If love costs me everything, then it's worth it." Evelyn pressed her hand against her mouth. She wanted to cry, to laugh, to shout, but all she could do was stare at the woman in the painting. She looked like herself, but freer, as if she had already forgiven the world. She hung it in her apartment above the table, where she arranged flowers every morning. It changed the light in the room, made it softer somehow. Months passed. Spring returned to New York with hesitant warmth. One afternoon, as Evelyn closed the cafe, a customer left behind a newspaper. The headline caught her eye. "Former billionaire Adrian Holt launches Haven Foundation for women affected by media exploitation." The photo beneath it showed him standing before a small crowd. No tie, no corporate mask, just a man holding a microphone and speaking about dignity. His words were printed below. "She reminded me what being human feels like." Evelyn ran her thumb over the line until it blurred. That night she took out her old typewriter, the one her mother had given her when she was 16, and began writing. Not to him, not for anyone but to herself. She wrote about silence and guilt, about pretending, and truth about love that began in the strangest place, imaginable a lie, and became the only real thing she'd ever known. When she was done, she folded the pages, neatly tied them with a ribbon, and placed them beside the painting. It wasn't a goodbye, it was a beginning. In Vermont, the light on the lake shifted as the sun set golden and infinite. Adrian stood on the dock, his reflection wavering in the water, the wind whispering through the pines. For the first time in a long time, he felt peace. He whispered her name to the lake just once, not to summon but to honor. And in the faintest ripple of the water, he imagined her smile. It was early spring when the world decided to remember Adrian Holt again. News of his foundation had spread quietly. At first, then caught fire when a video surfaced of his speech at a small community center in Vermont. He stood without a suit or entourage sleeves rolled, speaking to a group of women seated on folding chairs. "We live in a world that turns pain into headlines," he said, "but you can't shame someone into silence if they already know their worth." The clip went viral, and the comments filled with words like respect, forgiveness, redemption. For once, the press wasn't mocking him, they were listening. Yet for all the attention, Adrian stayed hidden from it. He didn't return to the city. He didn't grant interviews. He spent his days painting and teaching art classes for local youth, and his nights rebuilding the old barn into an art studio for community use. He didn't want to be admired. He just wanted to make amends in the only language he understood: creation. Evelyn heard about the foundation on the radio one morning while brewing coffee before her shift. She froze when she heard his voice, calm and familiar, cutting through static. It had been months since she last heard it, but the effect was the same, a quiet ache that found her heart and wouldn't let go. The announcer mentioned an upcoming exhibition, The Faces of Healing. featuring artists sponsored by the Haven Foundation. Curated by Adrian Holt himself, it would open in New York in 2 weeks. Her hands shook as she turned off the radio. She told herself she wouldn't go. But even as she said it, she knew she would. The night of the exhibition arrived cold and clear. The gallery glowed softly under golden lights, its walls lined with paintings from survivors, single mothers, and people rebuilding their lives. At the far end of the room, a large canvas hung covered by a white cloth. A crowd had gathered, murmuring, waiting. Evelyn stood near the entrance, unnoticed in her simple navy dress. She hadn't told anyone she was coming. She only wanted to see him one last time, to know he was all right, to convince herself she had moved on. When he appeared on stage, the crowd hushed. He looked different, not the polished billionaire she'd first met, but not the broken man from the lake either. He looked whole. The faint lines around his eyes told the story of sleepless nights, but there was calm in his expression, a quiet steadiness that only forgiveness could bring. "Thank you for coming," he began, voice steady, carrying through the room. "This exhibit isn't about fame or charity. It's about what happens when we stop hiding behind titles, mistakes, and fear. It's about remembering that art, like people, can be broken and still beautiful." He paused, scanning the crowd, and then for just a second his eyes found her. Evelyn felt the air leave her lungs. His gaze didn't linger long, but she saw it, the soft, astonished recognition, the faint tremor in his jaw. He cleared his throat, looked down, and reached for the cloth covering the central painting. "This piece," he said, "was the first I completed after I left everything behind. It's called The Girl Who'd Never Loved." With a single pull, the fabric fell away. Gasps filled the room. The painting was luminous. Evelyn's face bathed in morning light. Her eyes open alive, looking not at him, but beyond, towards something unseen. The brushwork was tender, reverent. Around her soft strokes of dawn, gold melted into lake blue. She wasn't a symbol. She was a person, free. Evelyn's vision blurred. People clapped, moved, whispered admiration. But she barely heard them. Her chest ached with 1,000 things: grief, pride, wonder, love. When the event ended, she waited until the crowd thinned. He was speaking to reporters, shaking hands. For a moment, she almost turned to leave. Then, as if sensing her hesitation, he looked up. Their eyes met again, and this time he moved toward her. "You came," he said softly, standing before her. "I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I," she said. "You didn't tell me you were painting again." "I didn't tell anyone," he said. "Some things need to be finished before they're shown." She glanced toward the painting. "You shouldn't have used my face." "I couldn't help it," he said. "It wasn't about ownership. It was about truth. Truth that I loved you," he said simply. The noise around them seemed to fade. "I still do. But I didn't come here to ask for anything. I just wanted the world to see you the way I did." Tears stung her eyes. "You destroyed me, Adrian. You broke something that didn't know how to heal." "I know," he whispered. "And I've spent every day since trying to become someone who deserves the chance to say sorry. Sorry doesn't fix it." "No," he said, voice trembling slightly. "But maybe it can plant something new in the cracks." She looked at him for a long time, searching for deceit, for charm, for all the things that used to shield him. There were none left, only honesty. "You built all this," she said finally, glancing around at the gallery. "For them. For you," he corrected gently. "For anyone who ever thought they were unworthy of being seen." The silence between them felt heavier than words. Then softly she said, I don't know if I can forgive you." "You don't have to," he replied. "You already did the moment you walked in." Outside the city buzzed with life. They stepped into the cool night air together. The hum of traffic and laughter filled the streets, but neither spoke. They walked until they reached the river, standing side by side, the water glinting under the bridge lights. "You're leaving again, aren't you?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I'll stay this time." "Why?" "Because peace doesn't live in places," he said. "It lives in people, and mine always seems to find its way back to you." She turned to face him, the wind tugging at her hair. "You don't get to say things like that anymore. Then I will just mean them quietly." She wanted to be angry, but she couldn't. The truth in his voice disarmed her completely. She looked at him, the man who had once ruined and then rebuilt himself, and for the first time, she saw him not as the billionaire who broke her heart, but as the artist who is still learning how to live. "You know," she said softly, "I think your lake finally forgave you." He smiled faintly. "How can you tell?" "Because you stopped drowning." They stood there for a while, the world rushing past them, until the city lights reflected in the water looked almost like stars. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "Thank you for coming back." "I didn't come back," she said. "I just stopped running." And then quietly, she reached for his hand. No promises, no performances, just two people, standing on the edge of something new. In the gallery above them, the painting, "The Girl Who'd Never Loved," caught the last of the light through the window. Outside, beneath that same light, the woman who once hadn't knew how. 1 year later, spring returned with a gentleness neither of them expected. The world had forgotten the scandal and the headlines, but Adrian and Evelyn had not forgotten what silence taught them. They moved slowly, carefully, as if learning how to exist again in a world that no longer demanded perfection. The old cafe on Maple Street had closed, but Evelyn found herself opening another one, not in the city, but in Vermont near the lake, that had once been a place of ghosts. She called it Haven Cafe, a name that came to her one morning when she saw sunlight spilling through the glass like forgiveness. The cafe was small, filled with second-hand furniture and shelves of books people could borrow. Every table held a vase of flowers she arranged herself. Adrian had insisted on building the sign above the door with his own hands. "You know you could just hire someone," she'd said, watching him. Saw the wood with quiet concentration. "I could," he'd replied, "but then it wouldn't mean anything." They lived in a small cottage near the lake, not the grand house that once haunted him, but a modest 2-bedroom place with creaking floors and a garden that refused to grow straight. On weekends, the sound of laughter filled the air as children from the art classes Adrian taught came to paint by the water. Some days he would sit with them for hours, sketching quietly, teaching them how to find shape in emptiness. Other days he'd just listen to them talk their voices, like small reminders that life continued. Evelyn ran workshops at the Cafe Flower Therapy, she called them. Women came from nearby towns, some shy, some broken, all carrying stories too heavy for words. She'd place buckets of daisies, tulips, and lavender on the tables and say, "We're not here to make perfect bouquets. We're here to remember beauty is not fragile." And somehow by the end of every session, there would be laughter and color again. One afternoon, a young woman stayed behind after class and said softly, "I read your story online about him, about you." "Is it true?" Evelyn smiled. "Parts of it. The rest is what we made of it." The girl hesitated. "Do you ever regret forgiving him?" No, Evelyn said, looking out the window where the lake shimmered. Regret is heavy. Forgiveness travels light. That evening she walked home through the golden light of dusk. The door was open, music playing softly inside. Adrian was in the kitchen, flour on his hands, concentration on his face. "You're cooking?" she asked, amused. "Attempting to," he said. "I thought I'd surprise you. The surprise will be if we survive it." He grinned, wiping his hands on a towel. "You have little faith." "I have experience," she teased, leaning against the counter. "How was class today?" "Good. One of the kids told me he wants to paint the sky red because blue is too sad." "And what did you say I told him to paint? However the world feels to him." "That truth is better than accuracy." "That sounds like something I once said." "It is," he admitted, smiling. After dinner they sat outside on the porch, a blanket wrapped around them, mugs of tea steaming in their hands. The lake reflected the moon like it was holding a secret between them. "You ever think about the beginning?" she asked quietly. "Every day," he said. "You asked me to pretend, and you said yes. You saved me from myself, Evelyn." "No," she said softly. "You just finally looked in the mirror long enough to remember who you were." He turned toward her eyes, warm, thoughtful. "Maybe, but mirrors don't work without light." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. He reached for her hand. "Do you miss the city?" "Sometimes," she said. "But I don't miss who I was there." "The girl who'd never loved," he murmured. She smiled faintly. "She's still here." But now she knows love doesn't have to be perfect, just present. A car pulled into the driveway, then its headlights cutting through the darkness. Evelyn stood startled until she saw who it was, a small group of teenagers from Adrian's art class, laughing as they climbed out, holding something large wrapped in canvas. "Mr. Holt," one of them shouted. "We finished it." They carried the canvas up the porch steps, placing it carefully before them. Adrian frowned in confusion. "What is this?" The boy grinned. "Your student's final project. We wanted to thank you and Miss Evelyn." They stepped back and pulled off the cloth. The painting took their breath away. It was the cafe and the lake behind it. But instead of people, the canvas was filled with light morning gold, soft blue, the glow of windows at dusk. And in the foreground, two small figures stood, hand in hand, blurred by the reflection, but unmistakably them. At the bottom, in crooked letters, it read, "To the two who taught us that love and art both come from forgiveness." Evelyn's eyes burned. Adrian swallowed hard. "You did this, all of us," the boy said proudly. "You said we should paint what feels like home." When the kids left, they brought the painting inside and leaned it against the wall. Neither spoke for a while. Then Evelyn said softly, "Home." "Yeah," Adrian said. "It's strange hearing that word and not flinching." "It suits you," she whispered. "It suits us." Later that night, she found him sitting by the window, sketching in a small notebook. "What are you drawing now?" she asked. "The future," he said with a faint smile. She leaned over his shoulder. He was sketching the Café de Lake and something new, a small gallery next door. "You're expanding." "We're expanding," he corrected. "The Haven Studio. For the kids, for anyone who needs a place to start over." She rested her chin on his shoulder. "And what will you do when it's finished? Maybe paint less, live more." "I like that plan. You should," he said. "You're in it." They laughed quietly, the kind of laughter that only comes when the storm has passed and the air is finally clean again. Outside, the rain began to fall, not harsh but soft, steady, like a reminder that even after sunlight, life still needed water to grow. Evelyn reached for his hand again, feeling the warmth, the pulse, the simple proof of being alive. You know, she said, for a man who used to hide behind glass walls, you've become surprisingly human. Dangerously so, he said with mock seriousness. Careful, you might fall in love again. I already did, she whispered. In the dim light, their shadows merged on the wall, two outlines, one life. Somewhere outside, a bird began to sing early, mistaking their laughter for morning. The city had changed since the last time they walked through it together. New glass towers glistened where the old offices once stood, but the streets still hummed with the same restless energy that had both built and broken them. It was a spring evening, warm enough that the air carried the faint scent of magnolias, soft enough that the light seemed to linger just for them. Evelyn's dress brushed her knees as she walked beside Adrian. Her arm looped through his. It had been exactly 1 year since the gallery show, the night she forgave him, not through words, but by staying. Tonight the world had decided to remember them again, but this time for something entirely different. The Holt Foundation and Haven Studio had grown into a national initiative. Art as healing had become the movement's motto, appearing in schools and shelters across the country. The press, once cruel and sensational, now spoke of redemption and community. Yet when journalists asked for interviews, Evelyn always declined. The story isn't about us anymore, she'd say. But tonight they'd been invited to a special exhibit in Manhattan, a retrospective of Adrian's work. He hadn't painted for months, claiming peace didn't always need to be turned into color. Still, when the curator reached out, he agreed quietly to show one last piece. The gallery shimmered with warm light, a far cry from the cold corporate galas of their past. People moved between canvases, whispering admiration. Adrian stood quietly near the back, his hand resting at Evelyn's waist. You nervous, she teased. Terrified, he admitted, smiling. Of what that I'll see her again. Who? The man who stopped smiling, he said softly. I don't ever want to find him again. You won't, she promised. He died the night you learned to let go. The curator approached, beaming. We're ready, she said. The crowd gathered as the final curtain lifted. At the center of the room hung a painting larger than any other. The brushwork was gentle but confident, the light within it alive. It showed the interior of a cafe, their cafe with sunlight, streaming through the window, catching in the steam from a cup of coffee. Behind the counter stood Evelyn arranging flowers, her expression serene. Sitting at a nearby table, sketchbook open, was Adrian. Neither figure looked at the other, but somehow the space between them pulsed with connection, like gravity had its own language. At the bottom of the frame, in faint gold letters, were the words, "The love that needed no pretending." The audience was silent, the air heavy with quiet awe. Evelyn stared, her throat tightening. You painted this, she whispered. A while ago, he said, before I stopped needing to. Why didn't you tell me? Because some love stories are best shown, not spoken. He turned to her, his voice low. That was the last painting I ever made. I haven't touched a brush since. It felt finished after that. The crowd applauded, flashes from cameras flickering like constellations, but in that moment there was only the two of them. She reached up, touching his cheek. You know, she said, smiling through tears. I think this is what peace looks like. No, he murmured. This is what truth looks like. After the exhibit, they slipped away unnoticed, walking down Fifth Avenue under a sky deep with indigo. Rain had begun to fall light and soundless, turning the streets into mirrors. They walked without umbrellas, laughing as droplets clung to their hair and eyelashes. Déjà vu, Evelyn said, remembering the first night they met under chandeliers and polite laughter the way he'd asked her that impossible question. "Can you pretend to be my girlfriend for a day?" she whispered, echoing him. He laughed quietly. "Apparently a day was longer than I thought." "Apparently," she said, smiling. "You know," he added, "I never thanked you for saying yes. And I never thanked you for asking. Would you have still said yes if you'd known everything that came?" After she pretended to think. "Probably not," she said with a grin. "But I'm glad I didn't know. Some miracles need a little foolishness to start." They crossed the bridge as the rain eased into mist. Below them, the river glimmered with city lights, and in the reflection she saw not the billionaire and the waitress, not the scandal or the headlines, but two souls who had walked through fire and somehow come out gentle. She squeezed his hand. "Do you ever miss who you were?" "No," he said. "He built this, but he doesn't live here anymore." "And who lives here now?" she asked softly. He looked at her, his gaze tender. "The man who finally learned how to love without pretending." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And the girl who finally did." For a long while they stood there watching the city breathe. The rain stopped. The clouds thinned. Somewhere far off, a street musician began to play an old piano tune, slow, melancholic, beautiful. Evelyn closed her eyes, swaying slightly to the rhythm. Adrian rested his hand on her back, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breath. When she opened her eyes again, she whispered, "Promise me something." "Anything. If we ever forget what this feels like, we'll come back here, to this bridge, to the rain." "Deal," he said softly. "But next time bring an umbrella." She laughed, the sound warm and effortless. The wind brushed past, carrying the faint scent of lilacs. He turned to her, brushing a wet strand of hair from her face. "Evelyn Carter," he said quietly, "you once told me you'd never loved anyone, not even yourself. Is that still true?" Her eyes met his. "No," she whispered, "because now I do. And it started with you." He smiled, the same rare, unguarded smile that once melted boardrooms and headlines, but now belonged entirely to her. "Then my work here is done," he murmured. "Don't say that," she said, half laughing, half teary. "We're just beginning." "Exactly," he said. "And this time there's no pretending." The city lights flickered gold against the wet pavement. She stepped closer, their reflections merging in the puddles below. When he kissed her, it wasn't grand or cinematic. It was quiet, steady, full of every word they no longer needed to say. Around them, the city continued its restless heartbeat, but in that moment, time stood still. As they walked back toward the lights, hand in hand, Evelyn glanced over her shoulder one last time. The bridge glowed behind them, framed by the shimmer of rain. It wasn't the beginning or the end. It was everything in between. The life they'd built, the love that no longer needed to pretend. And in that fleeting glow, New York didn't feel like a city of strangers anymore. It felt like home. Before you go, take a breath and stay with this moment. Somewhere inside, all of us lives a version of Evelyn, the part that has never been chosen, never been kissed for who we truly are, never believed we were enough to be loved without conditions. And somewhere, too, lives a version of Adrian, the part that hides behind success silence or sorrow pretending control, is the same as peace. Maybe that is why their story feels so real. Because it reminds us that love does not arrive perfect. It arrives trembling, flawed, and human. It begins in the most unlikely places, a cafe, a mistake, a quiet question whispered between strangers. And sometimes it saves us before we even realize we are the ones who need saving. If you have ever built walls around your heart, thinking no one could understand, remember this: someone out there is waiting to meet you. Exactly where you are not where you pretend to be. Love has a way of finding the cracks in our armor, of slipping in softly when we least expect it. It asks for courage, the kind that lets you show your scars, not hide them. The kind that lets you say, "I'm scared," and stay anyway. That was Evelyn's gift. That was Adrian's redemption. And maybe tonight it can be yours too. So tell me, Soul Stories family, where are you watching from tonight? Are you in a quiet room in Chicago, a porch in Texas, a small apartment in New York, or halfway across the world? In Trinidad or rural France? Wherever you are, I hope this story found you at the right time. I hope it reminded you that love worth having doesn't demand perfection. It only asks for honesty. If this story touched something in you, leave a comment below. Tell me what moment stayed with you. Was it the first question at the gala, the painting in the gallery, the quiet porch where forgiveness bloomed? I read every message, every thought, every heartbeat you share here. And if you believe that love, no matter how bruised or delayed, is still worth waiting for, let the world know right. I still believe in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe. If you want to walk with us through more stories like this, stories of redemption, tenderness, and second chances, because every week we explore what it means to be human again, what it means to love after loss, to stay after storms, to begin again even when the world tells you it's too late. And one last thing tonight, if you find yourself alone, don't see it as emptiness. See it as space for someone or something beautiful to enter, just like Evelyn did, just like Adrian did. Because maybe the next chapter isn't about pretending anymore. Maybe it's about believing. Till next time, Soul Stories fam, keep your hearts soft, your lights on, and remember, the love that changes your life will never need pretending.